Okay, kid, here's the scoop. It's 1940s Chicago. Mobs, crime, and Pearl Harbor are all the talk around town. Dames strut the street and newsboys are hawking papers trying to make enough cash to survive, and then there's you, a drugged up man waking up in the bathroom of a closed bar. The office upstairs is furnished by a familiar yet very dead body, and with the way the evidence looks, you'll be the one pegged for the murder. If you don't piece together this little mystery, it's going to be curtains for you, buddy. Fun little setup, right? The Deja Vu series is the last of the MacVenture games for us to discuss. The original MacVenture, released in 1985, Deja Vu was a very unique game for its time, set in a world inspired by hard-boiled detective novels and books about the 1940s Gangland. Deja Vu, A Nightmare Comes True, and later its sequel, Deja Vu 2, Lost in Las Vegas, were released on the original Macintosh and other platforms like the Commodore 64 and Amiga. The first game did make its way to the NES, but the sequel sadly never found its way onto the platform. Screenshots appeared in magazines, but the game never came to a Nintendo platform until 1999, when both games were packaged onto a single cartridge in the form of Deja Vu 1 and 2, the Casebooks of Ace Harding, for the Game Boy Color. Deja Vu was my first experience with the MacVenture engine on the Nintendo Entertainment System. While a lot of other kids were playing games like Maniac Mansion, my point-and-click experience came from Deja Vu. The original game on the Mac was a very early innovator into the point-and-click genre of games many of us grew to love. I said before that Princess Tomato and Salad Kingdom, along with the NES MacVenture games, were what got me into adventure games, and that's very true, but I really have to hand a majority of the credit to the NES version of Deja Vu. But though that version is great, the GBC port knocks it out of the water pretty easily with updated visuals and a better interface, and since it includes the sequel, that will be the version we'll be discussing at length today. Deja Vu, A Nightmare Comes True begins in a restroom stall in a bar in downtown Chicago during the 1940s. Your character has no idea who he is, where he is, or what happened to him. Aside from a small puncture in his arm from a syringe or something similar and a few items in a wallet, he has absolutely no idea what's going on. Upstairs in the bar, he sees a photo of himself as a boxer, but the name, Ace Harding, doesn't ring a bell. Inside one of the offices, though, he finds a dead body plugged full of holes, and his mug does look kind of familiar to him, but he just can't place it. Unfortunately, you don't just wake up in a building with a dead body and just assume that the two things aren't connected, and piecing that together is the core of Deja Vu's experience. It's a setup to a game that gives the character a little bit more of an immediate need to figure things out for themselves rather than Uninvited or Shadowgate, where the goal was more or less given to you in the beginning sequence of the game. The need for the player to utilize lateral thinking or solving puzzles using indirect and creative approaches that may not follow step-by-step logic is something that I've always appreciated about this game. That's not to say that other adventure games, including Uninvited and Shadowgate, don't do this, but Deja Vu combines detective skills, such as hunting for evidence, with puzzles solved with some form of violence or using your tools in creative ways, such as shooting a lock off a door instead of using a key. Gameplay-wise, Deja Vu plays just like its MacVenture younger brothers, with a cursor manipulated by the D-pad in order to select commands and objects. While the interface in any version of the games isn't that great by any means, I vastly prefer the GBC versions, since it uses icons to represent actions. A large amount of objects are able to be interacted with to some degree in Deja Vu, and things aren't always obvious. And it's actually really funny to see some of the quips the game comes up with when you examine certain objects. You'll need to actually look around and examine everything in order to find the things you need to proceed through the game, though the game isn't cruel enough to make these things too hidden that it becomes frustrating to proceed. There's still some minor annoyances with the game proper, of course. Deja Vu has muggers and money. The money is used to pay the taxi drivers to take you to the different addresses you discover in your investigation, so it's essential to keep a fistful of quarters during the game. I found it best to load up in a hidden casino you can stumble across early in the game, and it's really the only way to replenish your coin stash should anything happen to it, like meeting a mugger or spending it all on joyrides around Chicago. As you explore the streets of Chicago, you'll eventually begin to piece a few things about the stiff in the bar together. This is done by locating and finding clues and evidence. From invoices in desk drawers to diary entries, the plot begins to unfold as you investigate methods to getting your memory back, but also figuring out who the dead guy you stumbled across before is, and why he was killed. Even though this is a very early adventure game, Deja Vu does have other elements common in adventure games present. You'll need to locate keys and other items to find these important pieces of evidence and to gain access to different areas. I think there's less ways to die in Deja Vu than its younger MacVenture siblings, but there's still a few entertaining ways for our amnesiac friend to meet his end, such as getting arrested, typically by using violence in situations where it just isn't appropriate. Deja Vu forces you to get your memory back before you can really dive into the majority of the plot that frames you for the murder of Joey Siegel, the dead guy at the bar. Once you get Ace's memory back, your goal is then to figure out how to get yourself off the hook for a crime you didn't commit, and to find those responsible to get the police to make a move on them. The game won't let you proceed past a certain point in your amnesiac state, which is really the only hard narrative break the game takes. Everything else is really discovered when you feel like discovering it. That's one of the great elements of this early adventure title in whatever version you play it in. Once you've gathered sufficient evidence, you'll need to find a way to dispose of the evidence that frames you for the murder, then take all the necessary proof to the cops. Unlike Shadowgate or Uninvited, which are mostly about the progression through a small area, relatively speaking of course, Deja Vu is far more open, and you end the game just a couple of screens away from where you started. Considering Deja Vu is the first of the MacVenture titles created, it's interesting to see that ICOM Simulations decided to go with a more linear, at least in comparison to this game, approach for the other games like Shadowgate and Uninvited. Deja Vu 1 is one of my favorite NES games, and its transition to the Game Boy Color is fantastic. Unlike Shadowgate, this is my preferred version of the title. Everything from the writing to the graphics is a lot more refined and interesting and colorful. But after solving the first case, the GBC version immediately takes you to the next game, Deja Vu 2, Lost in Las Vegas. Ace, just after celebrating the return of his memory and solving a murder case that he almost took the fall for, is knocked on the back of his head and shoved into a car, and awakens in a hotel bathroom in Las Vegas. Now that's a little all too familiar setup for the detective, but at least this time he has his memory intact. The plot this time is that a big Vegas mobster knows Joey Siegel, the stiff from the first game, has had a lot of his money tied up in Chicago, and since Ace was one of the last people to see him alive and had a hand in his murder case, Ace clearly must know where the money is. Ace's goal this time around is to find out what happened to that money by combing over a few areas in Las Vegas, though the majority of the game does take place in Chicago and even in areas from the first game. Instead of trying to piece together a murder plot, your goal this time is to uncover what the mobsters are up to, and to get out of their crosshairs, since Ace is constantly being followed by one of the mobsters' goons, Stogie. From exploring places like Joe's bar again to Ace's own apartment for the first time, the second game is another great detective experience, and is actually a far more compelling mystery than the first game. What I like about Deja Vu 2 is just how much more there is to do in the world. While money is still a factor with riding the train back and forth to Chicago, the amount of characters to interact with is a lot higher, and the mystery is a lot more engaging. Plus, things feel a little bit more threatening with Ace being given a week's time before he's fitted for his own pair of cement shoes. In the first game, the main bad guys were not really a threat to Ace while you're playing the game, as they were merely waiting for their plan to fall into action. In fact, though you do have some interaction with them, they're asleep when you encounter them. In Deja Vu 2, on the other hand, you actually get caught and have to escape from different goons, talk to different characters, and even disguise yourself during the game. The narrative of the game actually advances when you find certain clues, unlike Deja Vu 1, where the player is only clued in on what goes on every so often. The occasional cluing in from the narrative draws out the character of Ace Harding a little bit more and helps the player feel a little bit more attached to his plight. Ace will uncover an extortion scheme involving Siegel and some of the mobsters, and the tipping point comes when you discover the truth, which is, excitingly enough, really found through a discrepancy between ledgers. But the real fun is making sure you've actually uncovered everything you need to beat the games. Both titles are rather non-linear, as the clues are the only things necessary to advance the plot and to get the ending, whereas the items and tools, like keys and finding certain address information, determine where you can get to and when. You'll gamble to make money in order to pay for the train rides from Las Vegas and Chicago, and thankfully your taxi rides are free this time around, and exploring areas from the first game is rather interesting, and having far more people to interact with make Deja Vu 2 a fuller world to experience in my mind. My favorite scene of this game is when you get captured by two of the goons, and escaping them is a fun, intense moment in the game, and even if it's rather short, it adds a little bit of legitimacy to Ace's situation. Deja Vu 2 concludes with a little bit more excitement than the first game. After finding everything out about the missing money, you'll need to plant the correct evidence into 2 different places, plus a few other items to sweeten the pie a little bit, since you're planning on really getting a little bit of revenge on the mobsters yourself. While I enjoy the second game a little bit more with its broader amount of areas to explore, clever writing, and more immediate threat to the character, it was never available on the NES, which is where I got most of my experience with adventure games. With a little bit of a gritty tone and an atmosphere right out of the turbulent 1940s, I consider Deja Vu one of the best adventure games around, though it's rather unlike games that came from companies like Sierra and LucasArts. The real downside to these games, and all the MacVenture titles, is that once you beat them, they are incredibly easy to breeze through again. Despite that, they're both wonderful titles, and I highly recommend the GBC versions of each. And that's the last of the MacVenture games for us to talk about. Deja Vu 1 and 2 are probably my favorites of the Venture series, but Uninvited and Shadowgate are also excellent games in their own right. I kinda wish we got an Uninvited game on the Game Boy Color, but as far as I know, that was never planned, and that's kinda sad. The MacVenture games really helped create different kinds of worlds in a very simple environment that was easy to pick up, understand, and play. And I'm always going to appreciate what they did to help teach me about the point-and-click genre, and that's kind of what helped shape it into one of my favorite video game genres of all time.